3 lectures breaks down those processes in time management. In this one we're just going to look at activity listing, or the activity definition of activities and the project sequence. So here, listing out all activities and the project sequence or sequencing activities. We look at the project in its entirety, and we have the work breakdown structure from the scope process helps us define those activities. And this work breakdown structure might have a key deliverable, that is, all the information needs are finalised. So that deliverable could be a milestone in our project. These are the work packages written as activities. Notice how they have verbs there, that need to be complete to finish this milestone. Okay, you can actually further aggregate this. So, for example, oops, that's not what I meant. For example, provide team information might include, activity 1, which is write the information, and activity 2 is maybe email the information. Okay, so there might be a number of activities for one work package. A schedule and a WBS don't have to be one-to-one. That's what I'm saying. But it's at this early stage in your career, making them one-to-one is probably a good idea. So each one of these is an activity. Once we've delivered all the activities, we have completed the project. So we work through the entire work breakdown structure, complete the activities to deliver all the parts of scope, and that's the end of the project. A good way of scheduling is to think in terms of milestones. The first type of milestone is the one that we're getting out of scope. So remember, we had the key or major deliverables to help us define scope, and that allowed us to create the work breakdown structure. Again, those key deliverables can be set as milestones. Deliverables is a scope term, milestone is a schedule term. Critical activities such as, it may well be, if you're doing a rock concert, it might be securing of all bands. That might be a critical activity, securing or the headline act. So that could mark a milestone in your project. So something that's really important in that project. Other types of milestones that can be used might not be deliverables, but they might be a point in the project where there's a financial commitment. It might be something that the project needs to pay, or it might be where the project gets refinanced for the second phase from the sponsor. So if you think about construction, you have an agreed payment schedule, so they're milestones in your project. The other thing is that you can think about milestones in the project when parts of the project sequence come together. For example, if you're doing a prefabrication of a part of an ore crusher, which is done in Henderson or here in Fremantle, and then you're importing the scree or the screen for this ore crusher, and you're importing that from Thailand. When those two parts are finished and they come together and are added to the entire ore crusher, when two major components come together, or a point in your schedule, a merging point in your schedule, that can also be milestones. Let's just make this number 1. That means that your milestones is when you've thought about this project, you thought about what are the key deliverables, the major deliverables. They need to be milestones in your project. So the idea of defining activities is you don't want to miss anything. You want to have all the activities, everything that's needed to complete the project needs to be articulated. Creating a sequence might uncover missing activities. So once we start creating a sequence, we can say, oh, hang on, wait a minute, before we can complete this particular activity, all these other things need to be done. We didn't think of those, so they need to go in the project schedule. Traditionally, and this is a PMBOK concept, is that a schedule create, that the final schedule, the agreed schedule, the approved schedule, we call a baseline. Actually, I'll just use an acronym. We'll call it baseline. Otherwise, you'll be watching me write all day. So there's the baseline. That's the approved schedule. We need to make sure that we've understood what the risks are, what the quality requirements are, what the financing requirements are, where our resources are coming from. So we can't baseline a project. We can't decide what the final schedule is until we've thought about all the related planning. So that needs to be in place. So the planning is quite iterative. You start off with the initial schedule, then you look at reality, you look at the resources, you look at what financing requirements are needed, are there any particular constraints on those resources, what quality metrics are we recording, what impact does that have on the schedule. So you almost go around, you go from the schedule, you go through all the other planning processes, which then recreates a schedule, which then might affect the other planning knowledge areas, which then recreates a schedule, and eventually you've got to come out of that loop and come up with what we call a baseline, the approved schedule, of which everything that occurs in the execution will be measured against. So what we're trying to do with a baseline is making sure that we understand anything. We're trying to avoid changing the schedule, just like we're trying to avoid changing the scope. To avoid scope creep, we're trying to avoid schedule creep here. We're not going to add things to our schedule. And perhaps as we go through defining activities, where are we going to work this out? Well, mostly experience. Okay. Who's done similar projects before and what happened on those projects? So using previous project templates, project plans can help, but you also might have templates. So you have templates to make sure you don't miss out on anything, and checklists. Any tools or techniques that can help you help you not omit any activities. That's the main idea of this. Of definition of activities. Once you've got your list of activities, you need to sequence them. What goes first, what comes second, and really the main concept is we're going to have to complete things before we can start other things. So that's a finish to start relationship. But independent of that relationship, we have what we call a predecessor activity, something that needs to go first, needs to be completed before we can have a successor activity, the thing that comes after the predecessor has been completed. The sequence of activities is to make sure successors follow on predecessors. So if we have an immediate predecessor, the successor comes after that. That creates a network diagram, and we draw an arrow to show the relationship between the predecessor and successor, and that then becomes our activity on node network diagram. So that's the predecessor and that's the successor. And then we continue that network diagram until we've completed all the activities. So that's all placed in one network diagram. These predecessor links can be mandatory. Things like logic, you can't put the ceiling on before the walls are in place. We cannot level the site until the soil test is being done. That might be mandatory from a regulatory point of view. So mandatory mainly refer to this sort of relationship where we have the ceiling goes onto the walls. So the walls need to be there before the ceiling goes. That's the main mandatory. Discretionary could be things like cash flow. I mean, you could always put the ceiling on, but you might not have the cash to do that. So you want to stretch out your project to fit with financing, or it could be just progressive elaboration. So we're not going to complete the second half of the project until we've done all quality inspections on the first half of the project. So even though we could have built, construction 2, we're not going to do that till we work out, how successful was construction 1, what should we change. So we can put what we call managerial discretion. Okay, so discretionary dependencies that sort of are there to control for risk or quality, those sorts of things. Here's an activity list, and there we go. You notice how they've got a verb, a noun, and sometimes a verb, a noun, and sometimes an adjective. So acquire, materials. What type of materials? Prototype materials. Produce, prototype. So verb, noun. So always starting with a verb. Alright, so these are activities. Determine new product features, acquire prototype materials, produce prototype, and finally perform sales call. Okay. We have mandatory dependencies and we have discretionary dependencies, which I'll let you read. This becomes our project network. It's an activity on node. Okay, that's each node has the activity, and the arrows mean the link. There are many types of predecessor to successor links. We really only want to use the finish to start where possible. Well, if you use any others, and this will be LAD 5, if you use any of the other type, you've really got to question it. You've got to say, why would I be using a start-to-start relationship or a start-to-finish relationship? Is that the right thing to do here? Typically, if you ask that question and you think about it, it'll always end up being finish to start. There's very few occasions where we have start to start, really. But we can use leads and lags. Leads are a bit more tricky, but lags are possible. Lags means putting buffers in the schedule, to deal with things like risk. So if we're bringing on a tugboat in an offshore project, which might be $150,000 a day, and we have to make sure all these other things are in place before that can be done, then we might want to put a buffer in the schedule to avoid any problems. Okay. If we delay it on those predecessor activities, it's going to cost us $150,000 a day in downtime. Leads are not recommended in the main. Typically we talk about them being fast tracking. So we define an activity and we're saying, well, we don't really have to wait till that finishes before we can start. We can use some of the output from that activity to get going in this subsequent activity. However, as you'll see in pipes and trenches, it's probably not the best way to schedule, so we don't use leads. We only use finish to start and lags.